Solomon River Valley, Kansas, August 1878. The sun was a hammer, beating the prairie grass into a brittle, golden mat. The heat shimmered in waves, distorting the horizon until the scattered cottonwoods along the river looked like smudges of charcoal. In the midst of this immense flat emptiness, a woman was digging. Not a garden plot, not a well, but a vast, rectangular pit, deeper than she was tall. Oksana Kovalenko worked with a rhythm born of generations. Her spade sliced into the dense topsoil, exposing the rich, dark clay beneath. The pile of excavated earth grew steadily beside the hole, a miniature mountain on the plains. Her husband, Stepan, hauled the dirt away in a wheelbarrow, his face set with the same quiet determination. A pair of riders approached, their forms coalescing out of the heat haze. One was Brig Tollefson, the county land commissioner, a man whose authority was as straight and rigid as the survey lines he drew. The other was Jedediah Morse, a farmer from 2 miles downriver. They reined in their horses, dust puffing around the hooves. Tollefson stared down into the hole, his brow furrowed under the brim of his hat. He was a man who understood things you could see: 4 walls, a pitched roof, a fence line. This excavation defied his logic. "Ma'am," he began, his voice dry as the dust, "what in God's name are you doing?" Oksana paused, leaning on her spade. She wiped a bead of sweat from her temple with the back of her forearm. "I am building my house," she said, her English precise but accented. Morse let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Building a house? Looks more like you're digging a grave, missus." Tollefson's gaze was colder, more official. He gestured at the pit with a gloved hand. "The Homestead Act requires a dwelling of no less than 10 by 12 feet, with at least 1 window. It does not provide for a man to claim 160 acres by digging a burrow like a prairie dog. This won't pass inspection for a patent." Oksana's eyes, the color of the prairie sky before a storm, met his. She did not argue. She did not defend. She simply said, "The winter will inspect my house." Then she turned, plunged her spade back into the earth, and continued her work. The riders watched for another moment. 2 figures of conventional wisdom baffled by an act of ancient knowledge. They shook their heads, muttered about the foolishness of immigrants, and rode on, leaving Oksana and Stepan alone with their growing hole in the ground. What did this Ukrainian woman, who had spent her life shaping the dense clay of the steppes, understand about the thermal mass of the earth that a county commissioner, a man of maps and deeds, had so completely missed? The answer to that question would rewrite the rules of survival in the Solomon River Valley. It's a story of quiet genius, of the immense power hidden just beneath our feet, and of how the harshest winters can reveal the deepest truths. I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand the profound physics of the ground you stand on. So subscribe to this channel and let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Oksana Kovalenko was not a carpenter. She had never felled a tree to mill logs, never pegged a mortise and tenon joint, never framed a gable roof. Her husband, Stepan, was a farmer, his skills tied to the turning of the seasons and the reading of the soil. Their 2 children, 10-year-old Danilo and 7-year-old Helena, knew the scent of black earth and the weight of a harvest sack. In their homeland near the Dnieper River, trees were precious, reserved for tools and furniture. Shelter was not made of wood. It was made of the earth itself. Oksana was a shaper of clay and sod. She understood the language of subterranean spaces. She knew the precise angle to slope an entryway to shed water, the right mixture of clay and straw to plaster a wall, the exact thickness of a sod roof needed to insulate against the brutal steppe winters. Her hands were not accustomed to saws and hammers, but to the trowel, the spade, and the feel of damp earth. She had grown up in a zemlyanka, a sunken dwelling that was little more than a gentle mound on the landscape, its heart kept warm by the endless constancy of the ground. Their first winter in Kansas, in 1877, had been a brutal education in the failures of frontier architecture. They had arrived too late in the season to build as Oksana wished. Pressured by convention and the coming cold, they had purchased a pre-cut log cabin kit from a speculator in Salina. It was a standard homesteader's box, 16 by 20 feet, with a single door, 2 windows, and a slapdash stone fireplace. It looked like every other cabin in the valley, and it was a death trap. The green cottonwood logs, hastily cut and poorly seasoned, began to shrink and warp as the first frosts hit. Gaps opened between them, thin cracks that whistled a constant mournful tune as the prairie wind assaulted the walls. They chinked the gaps with mud and grass, a desperate daily ritual. But the cold was relentless. It was a physical presence inside the cabin, a predator that could not be kept out. The walls sweated ice. Moisture from their breath and from the pot of stew on the hearth would condense on the frigid interior logs and freeze into a delicate, crystalline crust. In the mornings, Helena would trace patterns on the ice beside her cot, her fingers going numb in minutes. The family lived in their coats, huddled around a fire that consumed a staggering amount of fuel. Stepan spent most of his days with an axe, felling the scarce timber along the river. They burned through a cord of wood every week, a rate that was utterly unsustainable. The fire's heat radiated out a few feet, creating a small bubble of survivable warmth. But the corners of the room remained at freezing temperatures. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the house itself. It was a sieve, incapable of holding on to the precious heat they generated. That winter, Danilo developed a cough that rattled in his chest for 3 months, a sound that haunted Oksana's sleep. They survived, but barely. It was a lesson paid for in misery. Oksana swore they would not endure another winter like it. She would not build a house on the prairie. She would ask the prairie to be her house. The failure of the Kovalenko's first cabin was not unique. It was the shared, miserable secret of the entire settlement. The problem was not the quality of the construction, but the fundamental physics of the design. A standard frontier cabin was a thermal disaster, an elegant-looking machine for wasting heat. Its enemy was the very air it sat in. The physics are simple and brutal. Wood has a relatively low thermal mass. This means it cannot store significant amounts of heat. A log wall, even one a foot thick, is little more than a thin membrane between a 3,000-degree fire on one side and a -20-degree wind on the other. The heat generated by the stove, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs, was immediately radiated to the cold logs. The logs, in turn, conducted this heat to their exterior surface, where the Kansas wind stripped it away through convection. A 20-mile-per-hour wind at -16 degrees Fahrenheit has the same effect on exposed skin or a cabin wall as still air at -45 degrees Fahrenheit. It was an endless, losing battle. To stay warm, you had to keep feeding the fire, generating new heat faster than the wind could steal it. For families like the Morses and the Crofts, this meant a winter of relentless labor and gnawing anxiety. Silas Croft, a man with 3 young children, had run out of cut firewood by mid-January. He and his oldest son began burning anything they could find: fence posts, spare lumber, even a broken wagon wheel. His wife Martha stuffed rags and newspapers into the ever-widening cracks in their cabin's walls, but the drafts were insidious. "You can't find the source," she told Oksana one day, her face pinched with exhaustion. "The whole house is the source." Their water bucket, kept 6 feet from the roaring fire, would be skimmed with ice by morning. The lack of thermal mass also created wild temperature swings, When the fire was roaring, the area around the hearth could be a sweltering 80 degrees, but let the fire die down to coals in the middle of the night, and the cabin's temperature would plummet, dropping 30 or 40 degrees in just a few hours. Families slept in layers of coats and blankets, waking to the bitter cold and the urgent need to rebuild the fire. And then there was the condensation. Cold air cannot hold as much moisture as warm air. The air inside the cabin, warmed by the fire and humidified by breathing and cooking, was rich with water vapor. When this warm, moist air touched the freezing cold interior walls, the water vapor instantly condensed into liquid and then froze into a layer of frost. This interior ice was more than an inconvenience. It was a sign that the house itself was failing. As the frost melted during brief moments of warmth, it dripped down the walls, rotting the logs and creating a damp, unhealthy environment. The settlers were fighting a war on two fronts, against the cold from without and the damp from within. Their homes, which were supposed to be shelters, were active participants in the assault. By late August, Oksana's pit was complete. It was a perfect rectangle, 12 feet wide, 18 feet long, and 7 feet deep. The walls were sheer, cut with a precision that amazed the few neighbors who stopped to stare. She had found a spot with dense, stable clay, a material she understood intimately. Stepan, meanwhile, had hauled cottonwood logs from the river, not for walls, but for the roof beams. He laid them across the shorter 12-foot span, each log a foot and a half apart, their ends resting on a packed earth ledge at the top of the pit. Over these beams, they laid a thick layer of prairie hay, followed by the sod they had so carefully removed when digging the pit. They placed the sod blocks upside down, grass side down, so the dense root mat would interlock and form a solid, waterproof layer. Then, they shoveled the excavated earth back on top of the sod, creating a thick, earthen roof nearly 2 feet deep. When they were finished, the roof was perfectly flush with the surrounding prairie. From 100 yards away, it was invisible. The entrance was a set of gently sloping earthen stairs, cut into the ground and leading to a heavy wooden door set at the bottom. The walls of the stairwell were lined with stone to prevent erosion. The only part of the structure that rose above the prairie was the chimney. It was a squat, sturdy pillar of fieldstone, mortared with clay, rising just 4 feet above the ground. It looked less like a chimney and more like a survey marker. Inside the space was a revelation. The floor was packed earth, pounded until it was as hard and smooth as stone. The walls were the raw, vertical clay of the prairie itself. A small, efficient masonry stove stood against one wall, its flue connecting to the stone chimney. Oksana would later plaster the walls with a fine layer of clay slip, giving them a smooth, terracotta finish. But for now, they were the color of the rich earth. 2 small window wells, cut deep into the ground and lined with stone, allowed shafts of sunlight to penetrate the space, illuminating the floating dust motes. Brig Tollefson returned in September, this time with an official notice. He stood at the edge of the pit, looking down the entryway. "Mrs. Kovalenko," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the sunken space. "I filed a preliminary objection to your homestead claim with the General Land Office. This structure does not meet the legal definition of a habitable dwelling. It is a cellar. My report will state that you have failed to make the required improvements to the land." Stepan started to protest, his face flushed with anger, but Oksana placed a calming hand on his arm. She looked up at the commissioner, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Tollefson," she said quietly, "you see a hole in the ground? I see the thickest walls in Kansas. You see darkness. I see shelter. Come back in January. The House will make its own report." Tollefson scoffed, leaving the notice staked to the ground near the entrance. The mockery from the other settlers continued, though it was now tinged with a strange kind of pity. Silas Croft, hauling another load of precious firewood, shook his head as he passed. "It's a shame," he said to his son. "They'll freeze solid in that hole before Christmas. It'll be a tomb." The common wisdom was absolute. Warmth came from fire, and shelter came from walls that stood up to the wind, not walls that hid from it. The settlers of the Solomon River Valley were fighting the wrong enemy. They believed their foe was the cold air. But the air was just a symptom. The true enemy was thermal instability. Oksana's Zemlyanka was not designed to fight the cold. It was designed to ignore it altogether, by anchoring itself to the one thing in Kansas that was permanently stable: the earth. The principle is thermal mass. It is a measure of a material's ability to absorb, store, and release heat. A log wall has very little thermal mass. The air inside a cabin has almost none. This is why their temperatures can swing so wildly. But the earth, tons and tons of dense soil and clay, has an immense thermal mass. It acts as a colossal thermal battery. Below the frost line, about 4 to 5 feet deep in Kansas, the ground maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round, hovering around 52 degrees Fahrenheit. This is because the earth absorbs the gentle, sustained heat of the summer sun over many months, storing that energy deep within its mass. The brutal, short-lived cold of a winter blizzard is too fleeting to significantly change the temperature of this massive heat sink. The prairie ground is a reservoir of coolness in the summer and, crucially, a reservoir of warmth in the winter. By sinking her home 7 feet into the ground, Oksana wasn't just escaping the wind. She was surrounding her family with a permanent 52-degree environment. The walls of her home were not thin barriers of wood. They were the entire planet. To freeze her family, the winter would have to overcome the thermal inertia of thousands of tons of earth. It was an impossible task. Her small stove did not have to fight a minus 16-degree differential. It only had to raise the temperature of the interior air from the baseline 52 degrees of the walls to a comfortable 65 or 70 degrees. This required a tiny fraction of the fuel her neighbors were burning. The heat that did radiate from the stove was not lost to the outside wind. It was absorbed by the massive earthen walls, which gently radiated it back into the room, creating a stable, even warmth with no cold spots and no drafts. Oksana hadn't built a shelter. She had built a bubble of thermal equilibrium. The winter arrived in the second week of December, not as a gentle snow, but as an invading army. A Kansas blast, born in the Arctic, swept down the plains with a fury that seemed personal. For 26 consecutive days, the temperature in the Solomon River Valley never rose above minus 16 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was a constant physical force, sculpting the snow into massive drifts that buried fences and obliterated roads. The sun was a pale, useless disk in a steel-gray sky. For the above-ground settlers, it was a period of pure misery. The wind found every crack in Jedediah Morse's cabin, driving fine, granular snow into the corners of the room. His family abandoned their beds and slept on the floor in a tight circle around the stove. At Silas Croft's home, the crisis was acute. They ran out of firewood on the 8th day of the blast. They burned their fence rails, then a spare table, and then the 3 chairs Martha had brought all the way from Ohio. The sound of Silas's axe splitting their furniture in the frigid air was a sound of desperation. The ice on their interior walls was now half an inch thick. Their world had shrunk to the 6-foot circle of warmth around the hungry stove. Outside Oksana's home, there was nothing to see but a vast, windswept expanse of white. The snow had drifted over her sod roof, burying it completely, providing yet another layer of perfect insulation. The only sign of human life was the stone chimney, poking through the drift like a stubborn periscope, a thin plume of gray smoke rising from it and dissolving instantly into the gale. Inside, there was peace. The howling of the wind was a distant, muffled whisper, a storm happening in another world. The temperature was a steady 64 degrees. A small, gentle fire glowed in the masonry stove, fed by a single log every few hours. Stepan sat at the small wooden table, calmly mending a leather harness, the smell of wax and leather filling the air. Helena and Danilo sat on a rug on the floor, reading from a book their mother had brought from the old country. There were no drafts, no cold spots. The earthen walls, a constant 52 degrees, felt neutral and dry to the touch, gently radiating a quiet equilibrium. Oksana was kneading dough for bread. The rhythmic press and fold of her hands was the only sound, apart from the soft crackle of the fire. The air was warm enough that the yeast was alive and active, the dough rising beautifully in its wooden bowl. The simple, domestic act of baking bread, an utter impossibility in the Croft cabin, where a bowl of water would freeze solid overnight, was the ultimate proof of her design. She had not conquered the prairie winter. She had simply refused to participate in it. Her family was not surviving. They were living. On the last day of January, with the cold spell finally broken, but the ground still frozen solid, a man on horseback made his way slowly across the snow-covered valley. He was Arthur Davies, an inspector from the General Land Office in Topeka, dispatched to adjudicate the patent objection filed by Commissioner Tollefson. He was a man of the law, methodical, and impartial, but Tollefson's report had prepared him to find a squalid, frozen cellar. He found the chimney first, then located the gentle depression of the stairwell. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the snow, and knocked on the heavy wooden door at the bottom of the stairs. Stepan opened it. A wave of calm, dry warmth washed over Davies's face, a stark contrast to the biting cold on his back. He was momentarily stunned. He had expected a damp root cellar chill. He stepped inside and his eyes adjusted to the soft light. He saw the scene of impossible domesticity. The children reading, Stepan at his bench, Oksana pulling a golden brown loaf of bread from the stove. The air smelled of baking bread and clean earth. "Mr. Davies?" Oksana asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet with awe. He removed his thick gloves. Following an instinct he didn't understand, he reached out and placed his bare palm flat against the earthen wall. This was the moment of truth. He expected to feel a deep, penetrating cold, the frozen heart of the winter earth. He braced for it. Instead, the wall felt nothing. It wasn't warm, it wasn't cold. It was the temperature of his own skin. It was utterly, profoundly dry. There was no frost, no sweat of condensation, no hint of the brutal winter raging just a few feet above his head. In that single tactile moment, his entire understanding of shelter was overturned. This was not a cellar. It was a miracle of physics. He slowly pulled a thermometer from his coat pocket, an official instrument of government measurement. He hung it on a nail on the wall and waited. The Kovalenkos watched him in silence. After 5 minutes, he took it down and held it to the light from the window well. The mercury read 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Davies slowly packed his instrument away. He looked at Oksana, his expression one of deep professional respect. He took the patent forms from his satchel, uncapped his pen, and signed his name with a firm, decisive stroke. He handed the approved patent to Oksana. "Commissioner Tollefson reported that you had built a burrow," Davies said, his voice clear and formal. "He was wrong." He paused, looking around the warm, secure space. "You didn't build a shelter to fight the prairie. You built a piece of the prairie to be your shelter." The story of Inspector Davies's visit and the Kovalenko patent spread faster than a prairie fire. It began as gossip, then hardened into legend. Davies' official report, which praised the subterranean dwelling's remarkable thermal efficiency, was quoted in the Kansas Homestead Gazette. The article, titled "A Home Within the Earth," was reprinted by papers connected to land offices in Hayes, Wichita, and Dodge City. Suddenly, the Kovalenko place was no longer a subject of mockery, but a destination for pilgrimage. Settlers who had barely survived the winter blast arrived on foot and in wagons, not to jeer, but to learn. Silas Croft was one of the first. His face was gaunt, his pride swallowed by the memory of his children shivering under every blanket they owned. He stood in the warm, quiet space of the Zemlyanka and simply shook his head. "I don't understand it," he whispered, touching the dry wall. "We burned our chairs to stay alive. You're baking bread." Oksana did not gloat. She simply explained. She showed them the depth of the earth roof, the design of the entryway, the efficiency of the small stove. She shared her knowledge as freely as she had accepted the Prairie's shelter. By that spring, 3 more families in the Solomon River Valley were digging. They were no longer digging graves. They were digging homes. Within 5 years, dozens of soddies and sunken dugouts, inspired by Oksana's design, dotted the landscape of western Kansas, their low profiles and smoking chimneys a testament to a radical new and ancient idea of home. This act of frontier ingenuity was, in reality, the application of principles that modern building science would not fully codify for another century. Oksana Kovalenko's Zemlyanka was a precursor to the modern earth-sheltered home. Her understanding of thermal mass anticipated the core concepts of passive solar design and geothermal energy. She was using the stable temperature of the earth to heat and cool her home, a technique that today's engineers and architects strive to replicate with complex systems of geothermal heat pumps and heavily insulated foundations. She had no complex machinery, no modern materials. She had only a spade, a deep understanding of the earth, and the courage to defy convention. Her solution was not high-tech, it was deep-tech. The American frontier was built on an idea of conquest. Settlers arrived to tame the land, to break the sod, to impose their will upon the vast, indifferent prairie. They built their houses to stand up against the wind and the cold, to be fortresses in a hostile landscape. Theirs was a story of opposition, a constant battle between humanity and nature. Oksana Kovalenko arrived with a different story, one written in the earth of the Ukrainian steppes. Her wisdom was not about conquest, but about partnership. She understood that the prairie's greatest force, its immense, stable mass, was not an obstacle to be overcome, but an asset to be embraced. "The prairie shelters you," her house seemed to say, "if you are willing to become part of it." The ultimate safety was not in standing against the world, but in joining it. It required a profound humility, an admission that the ground beneath your feet knew more about survival than you did. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of frontier wisdom. If you found this exploration of thermal mass and earthen architecture as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of forgotten ingenuity. And tell us in the comments, what other ancient building techniques do you think could solve modern problems? This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices of building sod houses and dugouts on the American plains. Any application of these or similar building techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.